The invasion update for Overwatch 2 is finally upon us, and they have finally released the patch notes for all of the new changes that we will be getting, including those for the new hero, Illari. So to start with her, because I'm sure that she's the hero most people want to hear about, her primary fire is her solar rifle, which is a long-range auto-charging rifle. So it has a total of 14 ammo, and it works very similarly to how Widowmaker's sniper form has to charge up. Her primary will charge up on its own over time, and at full charge it will deal 75 damage, while at no charge at all it will deal 25 damage. It also has a 1.5 times critical hit multiplier, so on a headshot it will only deal 112.5 damage instead of dealing 150 like you may expect with the standard 2 times critical hit multiplier. Next up we have her secondary fire, which she does actually have. It is a medium range healing beam that consumes solar energy. So it is basically a Zarya beam that instead of dealing damage, it heals, and it works off of a resource gauge similar to how Moira heal does. From full charge, you can use it for about 3 seconds before it's completely depleted, and it fills itself up pretty fast on its own. And it does actually heal like a lot of health. I'll leave calculating the exact amount of health per second to someone else, but you can see how quickly it's able to heal a Pharah up from this example I have. It is a decent amount of healing. Before we go any further, please like and subscribe. Please don't hit the bell, it gives me anxiety if you do hit it. Yeah, and let's continue. Next we have her ability 1, which is Outburst, which launches you in the direction you are moving, knocking back enemies, and you can hold jump to go higher. So this is her movement ability that they showed off in the trailer, and it kind of does exactly what you think it would. Nothing special to it, just a movement ability. Over next we have her healing pylon, which is a lot more interesting. So I'll show it just how quickly it heals, but it also heals a pretty decent amount. The healing pylon combined with Illari's secondary fire probably makes her the highest healing hero in the entire game, at least not taking any AoE healing into account. But the amount of pocket healing that she can provide is absolutely absurd, and she would probably be broken for that alone, but she also has a very good primary fire that has a lot of range, deals a lot of damage. Again, she is absolutely busted in my opinion, and I can definitely see her getting some nerfs in the future. But for more specifics into how the healing pylon works, it's basically functionally a Symmetra turret. You can throw it, it'll stick to walls, it'll stick to ceilings, and it actually has a lot of range to it. A lot more than you would expect, and it does do its healing in bursts, and it will switch between allies to always be trying to heal the one that has the lowest health, and each burst heals for about 40 health. Now it gets very interesting with how its cooldown works. It's very similar to how Torbjorn's turret cooldown works, where if she throws it down, it goes on an 8-second cooldown. Once that cooldown is done, she can throw it down another one anywhere else, and it'll destroy the previous one, or she can also use the interact key to manually destroy the previous one, and it will not go on cooldown. However, this changes if the healing pylon has taken damage in the last few seconds. If the healing pylon has taken damage in the last few seconds, she cannot throw down a new one until it goes for a few seconds without taking damage, and also if she manually destroys it with the interact key within the range of time that she can't place down a new one, then it will go on a 12-second cooldown. And also, if it is destroyed, it will also go on a 12-second cooldown. So if you just throw it down, you get a slightly shorter cooldown of 8 seconds, and as long as it doesn't take any damage, you can keep relocating it, destroying it before it takes damage if you think it's going to, just so you don't get the longer cooldown for it. However, once it starts taking damage, if you destroy it, then you get the full cooldown. If it gets destroyed, it gets the full cooldown. And if you try and place down a new one, well, you just can't place down a new one. The ability is disabled. So yeah, honestly, feels like a rather insane ability, especially on a hero that has a really good primary fire and also mobility to make them good at flanking. She can very easily leave the healing turret with her team to support them, and then just go on a flank wherever she wants and just try and get a pick. And because he can immediately replace it, if she goes on a flank and now Steve's taking damage and she needs to heal herself, she can just throw it down for herself, assuming it hasn't taken damage from any enemies. So yeah, she seems like she will be a very, very good support. With her team, she'll offer some of the highest pocket healing in the entire game, and away from her team, she can still offer them healing while being able to just go do whatever she wants and try and kill people. And that doesn't even get into her ultimate, which is Captive Sun. And this fires an explosive ball of solar energies. Enemies hit are slowed and explode after taking significant damage. Now, this ability has a lot to it that I've tried to test out. So the projectile itself that she fires has a pretty decent range and deals 55 damage to anyone who is hit by it. And it will also apply a unique debuff that slows the target and also causes them to explode after they take a certain amount of damage. Now, the debuff lasts for approximately 7 seconds, and the amount of damage needed to trigger the explosion seems to be about 100 damage. And the explosion will deal 120 damage to the target, and it will also deal that damage to any nearby allies, or enemies in the case of the Illari that's using her ultimate. So yeah, this is the first support we've had that's really had a pure DPS style ultimate where they're setting up for these kills. They're still kind of setting up for them because any damage that is dealt to the target that is inflicted with the status effect will count towards it. It doesn't have to be from the Illari, so it does support in a way that the status effect can be triggered by allies, but the ult itself does a lot of damage, and especially if you hit a lot of people with it, you just have to trigger the ability on one of them, and then they'll explode, and that could lead to a chain of explosion that just wipes their entire team. It seems like it's an incredibly strong ultimate. I will say that the debuff from Illari's ultimate can be cleansed. So Kiriko can cleanse it, and I'm assuming that any abilities that also cleanse the user, like Moira's Fade or Reaper's Wraith Form or Zarya's Bubble, will also presumably cleanse the status effect as well. So there is a little bit of counterplay to it. Next up, we have a lot of other changes, but I'm mainly going to focus on the actual balance changes for this video. So next up, we have the general armor change. So armor health damage reduction is now additive with other sources of damage reduction and has a maximum cap of 50%. And I talked about this in the previous video, but as a shortened version, basically this means that before, the damage reduction from armor would stack multiplicatively with other sources of damage reduction. So taking Orisa's Fortify as an example, Fortify would reduce damage taken by 40%, and then the armor would reduce the damage taken again by 30% afterwards, meaning that the total amount of damage reduction would exceed the maximum cap that the game has of 50%. Now instead it will be additive with the Fortify damage reduction. So instead it would be Fortify reduces damage taken by 40%, armor reduces damage taken by 30%, it'll add those together for 70%, and then the cap is 50%, so it'll just reduce damage taken by a flat 50% instead. So instead of adding the armor damage reduction in a separate step, it will now all be done together with the ability damage reduction, so that it will respect the cap of 50%. Ramatra is another hero that gets impacted by this change because his block reduces damage taken by 75%. And if he had armor, then before this change, damage would get first reduced by block by 75%, and then the remaining damage would be reduced again by 30% from his armor. Now instead, it'll try and add the 30% from armor to the 75% from his block, and because his block alone already goes over the cap of 50%, the armor will just not add any additional damage reduction. His block isn't being nerfed, but his block is just going to be 75% damage reduction, regardless of whether he has armor or not. Moving into tanks, first we have D.va, who is receiving a couple of buffs. Her boosters are getting a cooldown reduction so that they are on a 3.5 second cooldown instead of a 4 second cooldown. This will help her be a bit more mobile and able to function more as a dive hero and as a counter dive hero. Because before, Winston was kind of able to just outmaneuver D.va because of how quick his jumps are, and now D.va will be more able to catch up to the Winston, and also just be more mobile in general. Then she also gets a buff to being ejected from her mech when her mech dies, and D.va will now be immune to all damage for 0.4 seconds while ejecting. Now this won't really do that much for her. As they said in the developer comments, once D.va's mech was destroyed, there was a window of time where the pilot could be damaged or killed before the player fully had control over their character. You could see this happen a lot. I've even seen times where the baby D.va was in the kill feed before the mech was even in the kill feed, and this is basically just going to make it so that she at least gets out of the mech before you can kill her. She's not going to be immune to damage while running around blasting people. It's probably just going to last long enough for her to actually be booted from the mech, and then she can actually take damage. Next up, we have Doomfist, who is receiving a couple of buffs. First up, Seismic Slam is seeing the cooldown reduced from 7 seconds to 6 seconds, and Power Block now reduces the damage from stuck projectiles. And with stuck projectiles, you don't have to be looking at them when you get stuck or blocking when you get stuck with them. Power Block will now just always reduce the explosive damage from a projectile that is stuck directly to Doomfist. And that's already a pretty big buff for his survivability. And on top of that, Seismic Slam is actually a pretty decent buff as well. I don't think Doomfist needs that many buffs. I don't really think he needs buffs at all. Doomfist is already a pretty well-performing character because of just how high his skill ceiling is compared to other heroes. And I think that's the biggest problem with them trying to buff him, is keeping in mind his very high skill ceiling and trying to buff him in ways that would allow them to keep that skill ceiling intact without making him absolutely busted, or having to nerf his skill ceiling. And I feel like the Slam buff is pretty fair. Slam gives Doomfist a lot of survivability because it has a very large range, and of course hitting any enemy with an ability will give Doomfist overhealth. So Slam being on a lower cooldown will just let him use it more often to gain survivability, or just use it as mobility to get out of a situation. It'll just make him much better at staying alive and in the fight, and also being able to get himself out of a fight. So I think it's a pretty fair buff. I don't think he needs a buff, but it's a pretty decent one nonetheless. Next up, we have Orisa, and Orisa is seeing 2 buffs. The first off is a buff to her fall-off range, and this is kind of big. I feel like we could possibly see the return of an Orisa meta, because adding 5 meters to any hero's fall-off range is kind of substantial in a lot of cases, just because it'll kind of increase their damage at all ranges, even beyond the start of the fall-off range, just because it starts decreasing a lot later. And Orisa kind of suffers from being a mid-range, or not even a mid-range only character. She's more of a close-range only character. And they did recently buff her damage a bit, and now they're giving her the range back as well, so she might actually end up being a force to be reckoned with in the mid-range, which gives her a lot more versatility and value. And in addition, they are also buffing Fortify, or as the patch notes put it, Fortify. Yeah, it's called Fortify. Cool grammar mistake. But Fortify will now see the health bonus that she gets increased from 75 to 125. So it's still just going to be over health, but slightly more bulk, just because they are nerfing Orisa a little bit with the armor change. So Fortify will be worse than it was before, but they're kind of trying to make up for that with the extra bonus health. So yeah, Orisa could be a strong contender in the upcoming meta. Next up, we have Ramatra, who is also getting the block changes. So in Nemesis form, his block will now reduce damage from stuck projectiles, which again, very strong, because stuck projectiles were one of the best ways to deal with characters that had a block, especially Ramatra, because he can just use his block whenever when he's in his Nemesis form. And then they're also increasing the cost of Annihilation by 12%. But overall, I would say that it's a net buff for him, just because the block chains will come into play a lot more often, especially against heroes like Tracer, who is a pretty common pick a lot of the times, and is good at killing him just because her Pulse Bomb will go straight through his block. You now can no longer just Pulse Bomb a Ramatra and almost confirm the kill on him, as well as Cassidy and his Magnetic Grenade, and I'm sure Bastion's grenade sticks as well. Probably some other abilities that I'm forgetting about as well. But being able to more consistently block those, I think, is more valuable than just not having his ultimate as often. But I feel like you could easily go anyways with whether it is a nerf or a buff. Next up, we have Sigma, who has his base movement ground deceleration increased to match standard heroes movement. So to explain what this word salad means, basically because Sigma floats in all of his animations, he had a lower ground deceleration than other heroes so that his movement would match with his animations better. You can basically think of it like Lucio. Lucio probably has the lowest ground deceleration out of all the heroes in the game. If he stops moving, he will slide for a while. Sigma is the same way, where if he stops moving, he will slide a bit further than other heroes. Or at least the standard hero, whatever that means. I don't know what heroes specifically are standard, but I would assume any characters that don't float. However, as they said in the developer comments, this led players to feel like his tank roll passive ability wasn't reducing the amount he would be knocked back, since it took him longer to stop than other tanks. So they changed his deceleration and changed it to match the other heroes so that it'll now feel like he actually has the tank passive. So it is a buff. Sigma will just get knocked around a lot less than before, which is good for any tank in the game. Next we have Winston, who actually is getting a nerf. So it turns out all the stuff shown in the hero mastery missions is stuff that's exclusive to PvE content, but Winston still is getting a nerf outside of that, and it is to his Tesla cannon. So Winston's secondary fire is seeing its charge time reduced from 1.2 seconds to 1 second. However, in exchange, the recovery time is being increased from 0.5 to 0.75 seconds. And this is important because it makes his burst damage with using his right click much worse than it was before. So his right click, using it at range to poke, it is better than it was before, but using it when you're trying to engage with a dive, it is worse than it was before, because now after using it, you have to wait an extra quarter of a second before you're able to start using your primary fire. And usually the charge time did not matter that much when you're using it when you're diving, because you can just wait as long as you need to before jumping in. So you could just fully charge it, jump in, use it in the air, and then start using your primary fire once you hit the ground. But now it's going to take you slightly longer to use your primary fire after using your secondary fire, so I would say it is a bit of a nerf to Winston's dive, but a buff to his, long-range poke game, which isn't really the reason why he's being played. Moving on to damage, we have Bastion, who is receiving a massive amount of random buffs. So first off, we have his maximum explosion damage falloff being reduced from 70% to 50%. So this just means that he will be dealing slightly more damage at the maximum range on his grenade. So before, his grenade dealt 100 damage. So if you were at the maximum range from the explosion and still getting hit by it, you would only take 30 damage from it, because the damage would be reduced by 70%. Now the damage is only being reduced by 50%, so at the maximum range, you will take 50 damage. Next up, we have the detonation time of the grenade being reduced from 0.5 to 0.35 seconds. The recoil has been adjusted to recover more quickly. So this is just how whenever you right-click as Bastion, there's recoil on his mouse afterwards. Now the recoil does not last as long as it did before. In addition, the projectile size has been increased from 0.2 to 0.25, so it is slightly easier to hit people with, and the impact damage has been increased from 15 to 30, so we'll also be dealing a little bit more damage when you stick someone with it. So now hitting someone directly with the tactical grenade will have it deal 130 damage total instead of 115 damage like it did before. Next up, Bastion's recon configuration has had its reload time reduced from 1.5 to 1.2 seconds, and probably one of the more interesting buffs is transforming into assault configuration now repairs 50 armor health. And this is kind of a pretty nice change because it just gives Bastion more bulk when he goes into assault configuration. The more important thing is that it says it will specifically restore armor health. So if he's missing a decent chunk of health, instead of just giving him normal health, it will just give him armor health, which is really good for Bastion in particular, especially going into assault configuration, because unlike how tanks like Ramatra and Orisa got nerfed by the armor change, Bastion appears to have actually been buffed by it. With the damage reduction from both his Ironclad passive, which reduces damage while transformed by 20%, and the 30% damage reduction from armor, while transformed with both armor and the Ironclad passive, Bastion will reduce damage taken by 50%, which is actually more than it did before when the damage reduction stacked multiplicatively. So Bastion actually getting a lot more buffs than people would think, since the armor change does also buff him up as well. Next up we have Cassidy, who is now seeing his health buffed back up to 225, but in addition his primary fire and magnetic grenade are both being nerfed. So his primary is having its damage fall off range rescaled from 25 to 45 meters to 25 to 35 meters. And his magnetic grenade now has a maximum travel time of 1.5 seconds, and the amount of slow has been reduced from 30% to 25%. And these are changes that I kind of like in theory. In theory, they promote him as being more of a close range to mid-range duelist, like he was originally envisioned to be. I thought it was stupid that he could yeet magnetic grenade halfway across the map and stick people, and I'm fair with them nerfing his damage fall off if they want to keep him in this medium to close range kind of area of expertise. But I think it's just too many nerfs. I think overall it's a net nerf. I don't think the health increase will make up for both the fall off distance nerf and also the magnetic grenade nerf, because even if they make sense to give him a unique identity, they are still nerfs, and even before this, Cassidy was not a particularly well-performing hero. People would pick him a lot to try and counter, you know, very strong picks like flankers and flyers, but he did not even do that very well. Soldier was just better at doing it in every single way. And that's why right now Soldier has one of the higher win rates in the game, and Cassidy actually still has one of the lowest. So yeah, I like the idea behind it, but I think they also need to give him some kind of buffs as well, because it does feel like they're kind of just straight nerfing a hero that already was not performing that well. And then the next hero that we have for damage is Hanzo, good old Arrow Man. He is Genji's brother, and he is getting one change, which is that now when you climb a wall, the draw on your arrow is no longer preserved. So before you could draw back an arrow and you could climb up a wall, and then when you got to the top of the wall, your arrow would still be fully charged. Now that does not happen anymore, and if you climb up a wall, you will have to draw your arrow back from the beginning. So yeah, Hanzo seeing a slight nerf, and that's really all there is to say about it. Next we have Soldier 76, who is seeing two changes. He's getting a nerf to Helix Rocket. The explosion damage is going back to 80 from 90, so Helix Rocket back to how it was before they buffed him. And in addition, he is getting a nerf to Tactical Visor, with the ultimate cost being increased by 10%, which is honestly fair. He was one of the best performing heroes in the game, and I don't think that the Helix Rocket nerf will really change it that much. I still think that he's going to be very strong, especially since he will still have right-click melee against Tracer. He just won't be as consistent at getting kills with Helix Rocket because it just did a lot of damage before. Next we have Sombra, who is getting nerfs to EMP. I don't know why they said she was getting some changes in Season 6, like they're going to do something interesting with her and then there's going to be a big rework later. But no, they just decided to straight up nerf EMP. The ultimate cost is being increased by 15%. And it also will no longer destroy Lifeweaver's tree. And again, I think these changes are very fair. EMP was an absolutely absurd ultimate for just how little it cost to get. Especially if you used EMP with a team with any sort of coordination, it was absolutely ridiculous. Since it would both deal 40% of every hero's current health to them as damage, it would also block all of their abilities for a second and a half. And if you just have any dive hero go in off of that, you could just wipe an entire team with just that ultimate. It was so good. And again, no longer destroying Lifeweaver's tree. I guess that's technically just a Lifeweaver buff, because before For some reason, EMP treated the tree as if it was a barrier and just instantly killed it, because that's how EMP interacts with any barriers, is they get instantly destroyed. Now the tree will just take 40% of its current health as damage. And then finally, rounding out the DPS changes, we have Torbjorn, who is getting his weapon swap time reduced from 0.5 to 0.4 seconds, change that basically means nothing. Then in addition, he is seeing his primary fire recovery time reduced from 0.55 to 0.48 seconds, and he is seeing Forge Hammer see its swing recovery time reduced from 0.75 to 0.6 seconds. And these are actually some pretty good buffs for Torbjorn. Having a faster fire rate on his primary is pretty good considering just how effective of a spam weapon it is. I'm not sure if this change in recovery time will also be included in his overload. So if overload will also see a slight improvement to its fire rate for its primary, or if overload will still just have the same fire rate it did before, and he only gets the buff when he is in standard Torbjorn mode. But yeah, I honestly feel like Torbjorn is just a better Cassidy right now, especially with these changes. He actually has a faster firing rate than Cassidy. So if you can be good at hitting your projectiles, then he will probably be very good with this new change. Especially since, you know, they just nerfed Cassidy's fall off range, and Torbjorn is a projectile, or he has a projectile. He also is a projectile. You could easily pick him up and throw him. He's a very small boy, but Torbjorn's primary is a projectile, meaning it doesn't have any fall off at all. So it'll deal 70 damage regardless of what range you're at, which is pretty insane. Next, we're moving on to supports, and first off, we have Ana getting some nerfs to her primary. So her damage and healing per projectile is being reduced from 75 to 70. However, in exchange, her unscoped projectile size is being increased from 0 to 0.1. So getting the nerf buff treatment, and I'm fine with it because I feel like Ana was in an incredibly dominant position before. She had one of the highest pick rates and also one of the highest win rates for a support, and also just has two of the strongest abilities in the entire game in the form of Sleep Dart and Anti-Nade. So I'm fine with them reducing her healing because she also had some of the highest healing in the game. I will say that I do think it's kind of a nerf because the biggest thing with Biotic Rifle having the 75 damage was that it made Ana pretty decent against Tracer because she could 2-tap her with her primary. And while she is being buffed with the unscoped projectile size being increased, which is a change that will only impact firing at enemies because projectiles have always had a larger size for allies. While it seems like it would be a really good buff, the main heroes that it helps against hitting is very fast close range heroes like Tracer. And I could really feel the buff when I did play Ana with the chains. It was a much easier to hit a Tracer that was trying to kill me, but I feel like the nerf to her damage kind of outweighs the benefit of the easier to hit projectiles, because even though they're easier to hit, you can no longer 2-tap the Tracer, and trying to 3-tap other characters is now not as consistent as it was before, because before they would have to get more than 25 health restored to them in order to survive, and she could also 3-tap 225 health heroes that don't get any help, and now a character only needs to receive 10 health in order to outlive Ana's damage. So I do think that this will be a net nerf for Ana. Moving on, next we have Brigitte, who is getting a nerf to her barrier and also a nerf to rally. So barrier is having its health reduced from 300 to 250, and Rally is seeing its ultimate cost increased by 6%. Now, will this change do a lot to Brig? I honestly don't think so. Brig's survivability always came from her mobility. The fact that she can use Sealed Bast to get herself out of situations, and then try and get behind a corner, get back to cover, etc. And also just playing far away from people and using Whipshot to knock people away when they got close. She was always a hero that tanked and made space with her abilities rather than with her barrier. Her barrier was just kind of a last resort against characters like Tracer and flankers because the barrier only had 300 health. It wasn't going to do much in a sustained team fight. So reducing it down to 250 HP doesn't really impact her that much. Next up we have Kiriko, who is actually kind of getting Gigabuffed. So Protection Suzu The knockback has been removed, the healing has been reduced from 50 to 40, but in exchange it now heals for an additional 30 health when you cleanse a negative status effect. And I feel like that's pretty big because usually you use Suzu for cleansing a status effect, or you use it for trying to prevent someone from dying just for the invulnerability that it provides. You never used it for the healing, so the fact that the healing is being nerfed by only 10 doesn't really matter that much at all. Meanwhile, using it to cleanse a status effect will now basically completely heal off the status effect. I mean, in particular, if it's an anti-nade that does 60 damage, it's gonna fully heal off that 60 health since it heals for 70 health total now. And then also, Kunai, kind of getting a major buff. So the damage is being increased from 40 to 45, the recovery time reduced from 0.55 seconds to 0.5 seconds, and the critical damage multiplier being reduced from 3 times to 2.5 times. And all of this is a massive net buff for Kiriko. Knockback on Suzu, basically a gimmick. It never really mattered that much except for getting funny environmental kills, and it does get more health restored when using it to cleanse a negative status effect. So it's more or less the same. I don't think the nerfs matter that much, and the buff is kind of useful in situations you need to heal someone back up after they've been inflicted with an anti. And the big thing is with Kunai. Kunai was always a very hit or miss weapon because it could either randomly 2-tap you from across the map or basically do nothing if you're just hitting body shots with it because of the massive disparity in damage between getting a headshot or a body shot. So now her damage output will be more consistent. It's not going to be as swingy in either the low or the high direction, but it still keeps all of her breakpoints intact. Actually, a lot of them are even better than they were before. So before, a headshot and 2 body shots would deal exactly 200 damage. Now, a headshot and 2 body shots will deal 202.5 damage. So even more than it did before, because now her headshots will deal 112.5 damage, and body shots will deal 45. And in addition to that, with the reduced recovery time, she also throws them out faster, so she has a faster fire rate as well. So while it's like, yes, they did nerf her headshots so they don't deal 120, but they heavily buffed the lower end of her damage. She now just deals more to any targets that could not be hit with a headshot, or if she's just not getting those headshots, she's not going to be able to deal the same amount of damage, but body shots deal more. 2 headshots will still kill a 225 health hero. They'll also still kill a 200 health hero with 2 headshots. All of the breakpoints are still the same, it's just that now her bottom end is much higher, and she also just throws them out faster, so she does even more damage in terms of fire rate. So yeah, Kiriko kind of got pretty big buffs in this patch for some reason. But that is nothing compared to Lifeweaver. Lifeweaver is going to be absolutely insane. So in a video I'm still working on, but I've not released, at the start of Season 5, I played Lifeweaver in mid-Grandmaster games for about 10 hours, and he felt fine to me. I could clearly see where his weaknesses lied and when you would want to switch off of him, but even despite that, I still managed to have a pretty okay win rate with him. And that was before he got the buffs in the mid-season patch, and also these buffs that he is getting again. So for Lifeweaver, his base health is being reduced from 200 to 175. He is also having his base shield health increased from 0 to 50. So yes, Lifeweaver is now a 225 health hero, and 50 of that will be shield health. And how shield health works is after not taking damage for 3 seconds, the shield health will heal itself back up, similarly to the way that the support passive does. In addition, his damage is now getting its spread reduced by 25% for one of the 2 projectiles that are fired each time you fire it. His rejuvenating dash is getting its healing increased from 25 to 50. Life grip is getting the mobility logout duration increased from 0.45 to 0.75 seconds. And what this means is that whenever you life grip someone, there was a 0.45 second window where you couldn't use a movement ability to get out of it, so that, you know, you don't try and pull someone and then they just immediately cancel it out of the pull with a movement ability. So now that window is slightly longer, that they can't just cancel life grip with a movement ability, so it doesn't accidentally happen and you end up accidentally killing your Reinhardt because he went for a pin, but you pulled him right before, and you pulled him over a cliff, and then he pins out of the life grip and cancels it and just plummets into the abyss. So that should happen less often. But probably the biggest change to Lifeweaver is Tree of Life. This ult will actually be very good now. Before, it was pretty underwhelming because of how it only gave out its healing every couple of seconds, and even then it would only give it 75 health. So if you were at full health when it gave out its healing, you got nothing, and you would get nothing for the next couple of seconds, meaning that you could easily get destroyed by a hero like Soldier 76 or get one clipped by Tracer. But now, half of the healing that the Tree of Life gives will be converted into overhealth, up to a maximum of 100 overhealth. So now Tree of Life is more like Rally. It kind of makes it really good because of the initial burst of healing that you get when you first place down the tree. You can straight up use Tree of Life like a defensive ult now, because one of the only good ways that you could use Tree of Life before was by placing it down mid-fight when people get low. Because when you first place down Tree of Life, it heals for 150 health to everyone in range the moment that you place it down. And because you can actually control when that healing goes out, that was usually the best part of the ability and the way you could get the most value out of it. And that 150 healing from when you first place down the tree now gets 50% of its overhealing converted into overhealth. So using this when an enemy pops something like a blade will just instantly give everyone in range of it an extra 75 overhealth, which is pretty good. It's not as insane as something like Sound Barrier or something like, you know, Zenyatta's Transcendence, but the fact that you can basically activate it instantly without any sort of cooldown, and it has a pretty decent range, is pretty good. And then it'll still stick around on the field and provide that 75 health per pulse for, I believe it lasts for 12 seconds. After that is really good. And Lifeweaver may actually be a very, very strong pick now with all of these buffs that he's gotten. Next up, we have Lucio, who is seeing a pretty good buff to his survivability, because we all know that Lucio is not very survivable as a support, so clearly he needs this. And the change is that Crossfade's self-healing penalty is now being reduced from 60 to 0% for the duration of Amp It Up. So what this means is that Lucio's Crossfade healing actually heals himself for less than it does allies. So normal Crossfade will heal allies for 16 health per second, but it will only heal Lucio for 10 health per second. And for Amp It Up, allies would be healed for 52 health per second, while Lucio himself would only be healed for 32.5 health per second. And now with the new change, while he is using Amp It Up, Lucio now no longer receives the reduced healing, so Lucio himself will now also receive 52 health per second from his healing while he is amping it up. So a bit of a survivability buff for Lucio, for reasons, I guess. And then finally, closing out the balance changes for PvP, we have Mercy, who is getting her damage boost reduced from 30% to 25%. And now, I talked about this a lot in the previous video where we speculated on a lot of these changes. I think we called it something like Winston being nerfed, and that ended up not being the case, but it also was the case because he did get nerfed, but just in a very different way. But basically, I don't think this damage boost nerf will change Mercy that much. The reason why Mercy is very strong isn't because of damage boost, it's because she is a pocket style hero. Any fight engaged against a hero that is being pocketed by a Mercy is a 2v1. She will be able to heal them and make it take longer for you to kill them than it will for them to kill you. And that's the big reason why it's so hard to kill a hero being pocketed by a Mercy. It's not because of the damage boost, it's because she's just going to immediately swap over to healing whenever the target needs it, and greatly extend their lifespan, making it much more likely for the pocketed hero to win the duel. So next we have balance changes for co-op, which I will just very quickly go over just because they are technically balance changes, but they're not for PvP, so I don't think there's a lot of use into talking about them and whether they're a nerf or a buff, because they're just changes. So quickly running through all of these. General gameplay changes: heroes will no longer passively gain ultimate charge over time in co-op, and the ultimate cost has been increased for all heroes in co-op game modes. For Winston, his Tesla Cannon secondary fire now chains up to 4 additional nearby enemies, dealing depreciating damage each chain. And in addition, his jump pack landing damage now increases while in the air up to 250% more damage over 2.5 seconds. Zarya has had her particle barrier duration increased from 2 seconds to 3 seconds. Her projected barrier duration has been increased from 2 seconds to 3 seconds. Graviton Surge has had its damage over time increased from 5 to 30, and her energy degeneration rate has been reduced from 2 to 1.5 energy per second. For Cassidy, Deadeye, the initial charge rate has been increased from 130 to 325 damage per second. The ramped charge up rate has now been increased from 260 to 650 damager per second, and he now has a maximum damage cap of 1560 damage per target. For Echo, her focusing beam has had its damage per second increased from 50 to 85, and her duplicate has been changed, so you can now duplicate her allies in co-op modes, and the duration has been increased from 15 to 20 seconds. And the ultimate charge rate multiplier during duplicate has been increased from 4 times to 9 times. For Genji, his shuriken damage has been increased from 27 to 29, Deflect has had its duration increased from 2 to 3 seconds, and Dragon Blade has had its duration increased from 6 seconds to 8 seconds. For Mei, her primary fire damage per second has been increased from 55 to 100. For Pharah, her hover jet and her jump jet now increases movement speed by 30%. Her Concussing Blast now deals explosive damage that has been increased from 0 to 30, so it now just deals 30 damage instead of not dealing any damage before. Barrage has had its explosion damage increased from 30 to 35, and her hover jet's passive has had its maximum fuel increased by 20%. For Torbjorn, his turret damage has been increased from 11 to 15. For Tracer, her ammo has been increased from 40 to 60, and her damage has been reduced from 5.5 to 5. In addition, her Pulse Bomb has had its damage increased from 350 to 550. For Brigitte, her Sealed Bass has had its damage increased from 50 to 60. Rally has had its duration increased from 10 to 15, and in story missions in particular, apparently, Rally does not increase the barrier shield size, so her barrier will stay the same size in story missions in particular. And then her Inspire passive, the total healing has been reduced from 75 to 55. Now for Lucio, Soundwave has had its cooldown reduced from 5 seconds to 4 seconds, and for Crossfade, his speed boost now also increases attack speed by 20%. And yeah, that is it for the balance changes this time. This took a very long time because there are a lot of them compared to the usual amount that we get, and a lot of them are very interesting. So yeah, that's it for this time. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and until next time, see ya.